Well, we're continuing on in our series of questions, and so you've turned in questions to us, and hey guys, it's nice to see you guys. It's been a while. You missed church a couple of weeks. It's really good. Sorry, some friends back in town. Good to see you guys. We're continuing on in our series on questions, and the question that we're looking at today is one that's a challenging one, which a lot of the questions that we've been looking at are challenging questions. And our temptation is, in challenging questions, to try to oversimplify it. And I understand we do that because it's nice if we can sort of have a clean, neat package, right? And say, okay, this is how it works. But C.S. Lewis challenges that in his book, Mere Christianity, when he says this. I love these words. He says, I'll tell you another view that's too simple. It's the view that I call Christianity in water. The view which simply says there's a good God in heaven and everything is all right, leaving out all of the difficult and terrible doctrines about sin and hell and the devil and the redemption. It's no good asking for a simple religion. After all, real things are not simple. They look simple, but they're not. The table that I'm standing at looks simple, but ask a scientist to tell you what it's really made of, all about the atoms and how the light waves rebound from them and hit my eye, and that what they do to the optic nerve and what it does to my brain. And of course, you find that what we call seeing a table lands you in the mysteries and complications which you can hardly get to the end of. Besides being complicated, reality in my experience is usually odd. It's not neat, not obvious, not what you expect. For instance, when you have grasped that the Earth and other planets all go around the sun, you would naturally expect that all the planets were made to match, all at equal distances from each other, say, or distances that regularly increased, or all the same size, or else getting bigger or smaller as you go further from the sun. In fact, you find no rhythm or reason that we can see about either the sizes or the distances. And some of them have one moon, and one has four, and one has two, some have none, one has a ring. Reality, in fact, is usually something you could not have guessed. That's one of the reasons I believe Christianity. It is a religion that you could not have guessed. If it offered us just the kind of universe we'd always expected, I should feel we were making it up. But, in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone would have made up. It has just that queer twist about it that real things have. So let us leave off all these boys' philosophies, these oversimple answers. The problem is not simple, and the answer is not going to be simple either. But we do like simple answers. We do like to boil things down, and we like things to pencil out in a way that makes sense to us. But it's just that things don't always work out quite that way. And so sometimes we just come to a place where we say, well, we just have to take it by faith. That's it. We're going to take everything by faith. That's all we can really do. That's an idea that's called fideism, and it's the view that everything that can be known with certainty about God or divine things is known only or primarily by faith and never by reason alone, right? Just say, we just have to take it by faith. And in the end, that's where we get to at times. There are things that we can't really get sorted out in a way that makes us happy or makes us be able to just rest. And maybe that's where we'll come to today. And so when we think about the question of today, what is suffering? Right? That's what we're talking about today. The question that was asked is, why does God allow the people he loves to suffer? I want to actually expand that a little bit wider and say, why does God allow suffering at all? Why does God allow evil at all? Right? Because we just want to think about that, right? And we say things like, wouldn't it be better if we lived in a world where there wasn't suffering? Wouldn't it be better if we lived in a world where evil didn't exist? And it's everywhere, right? You don't have to look far to see it. And sometimes when we're going through suffering, we have people who will come along to us, and they're trying to be helpful, and they'll say these sorts of things. You just have to trust God, right? Or there's a reason for it, like God's got a reason for this, or it's all going to work out the way that it's supposed to, or the way that it was meant to be, or this was meant to be. And maybe in the end that's where we get to, but that's not always the easiest way to approach it, right? And so not always the easiest thing to hear, right, when you're in the midst of it. You're going through a really hard time, and somebody comes, well, God's got a plan for your life. That's cool. I hate the plan, right? That's great. I don't like the plan, and I'm looking for a new plan. because I don't want things to be hard. I don't want things to be like this. And the problem of evil poses no small problem to the Christian world. It's one of the most difficult arguments that some people face. And it's actually an argument that causes some people to just go away from God and to say that it's not rational to believe that a good God exists in view of evil. Or in view of suffering, it's not reasonable to assume or to believe that there's actually a God. And so when we break down the idea of suffering or the problem of evil into basic terms, here's what we want to say. Okay, first of all, if we posit the idea that God is omnipotent, right? That is that God's all-powerful. Let's embrace that. Then we can recognize that God is morally perfect and omnibenevolent. That is, God is completely good. If God is all-powerful and if God is completely good, we have to recognize in the midst of that evil exists. Why does evil exist in the face of an all-powerful and an all-good God? If God has the power to prevent evil, and we expect that he would because he's morally perfect and omnibenevolent, why do we still see evil? That's the question that a lot of folks want to ask. So God is either not omnipotent, right? He's not all-powerful, or he's not all good. God isn't good, or he's not all-powerful if evil still exists on this view of evil. And so the Christian's idea of God is irrational. That's the argument that people will make. Yeah, I mean, that's really quite a specific argument. Maybe we could say it more simply like this. If there's a God who's all-powerful and completely good, then evil wouldn't exist. So either God isn't completely good, and he is in fact a nasty creature who allows evil things to happen and even causes them, or he's not all-powerful, which is to say, he's doing his best to stop all the evil, but isn't quite up to the task. In either case, on this view, this God is not praiseworthy. Does that make sense? So there are going to be people in the world who say, if there was a God, evil wouldn't exist. But evil does exist, and so it's not rational to believe that there's a good God, because he would eradicate evil if he was capable of it. Since he doesn't appear to be capable of it, because we know evil still exists, suffering still exists, therefore it's not rational to believe that there is a God. And so how do we approach that? How do you approach that topic with friends and with the people that you talk to about who God is? There are multiple ways to think about it. There are some possible answers to evil and suffering that we could embrace. One of them is this: because there is suffering, there can't be a good God, right? We could just say that. Like, because suffering exists, it's not rational to believe that there's a good God. Therefore, God doesn't exist. Therefore, Christianity is silly, and anyone who believes in God, it doesn't make sense. There can't be a good God in view of evil. Now, here's the problem with that view. You still have to deal with suffering. That doesn't make suffering go away in the world. Now you're dealing with it apart from any sense of that there's any help for it, right? It's just the way the world is. It's random, it's unexplainable, it's just evil, and God doesn't exist. And so now you haven't solved the problem of suffering and evil in the sense that you have put it off and go, okay, well, at least now it makes sense that the world exists this way. You still have to deal with it. There still is a thing called suffering. We all know it. We all know it when we see it. Maybe the second possibility would be this, that God in his sovereignty brings suffering into our lives. Like he's actually the cause of the suffering that comes into our lives. And he has it as a purpose for perfecting us and maturing us and bringing himself glory, right? There's that idea. That the suffering and the difficulty, the evil that we face, God actually brings into our lives purposefully for the purpose of maturing us and shaping us and maturing us and for his ultimate glory. That's another way of viewing it. I'll tell you my challenge with this point of view personally. It's difficult for me personally to reconcile a good father with the extreme pain that we see in the world. All I can do today is give you my perspective, and how I've thought about these things. But the reality is, you got to say, it's a good God who's created. I mean, and I know we say things like, well, sometimes as parents we bring painful things into our kids' lives. Like, this is one that we use a lot. You take your kids to the dentist. It's going to hurt a little bit, but at the end of it, they're going to have their teeth will feel better. Okay. That doesn't answer some of the big things for me, right? I get that, right? Yeah, we get our kids, you got to get a shot, or you got to do this thing, and we're going to bring a little bit of, okay, I get that. But that for me doesn't answer the enormous evil that we see in the world. That doesn't answer for me the Syrian crisis. That doesn't answer for me some of the things that Christians are going through every day in the world. Even today, remember a couple of weeks ago I said to you, according to Open Doors, 11 Christians are martyred every day in the world. So there's that idea. So I struggle with that personally. Maybe the third idea is this, that God allows evil and suffering in the world, but he doesn't want the suffering to be meaningless. Like God allows it. Clearly he allows it, because if God does exist, and so does evil, God's clearly allowing evil. And the problem with this one is that we still have to endure it. Right? We still have to go through it. The evil still exists, and we still have to go through it. And so, as I look at this and have thought about this question over the years, it occurs to me that evil and suffering are in the world because the sort of world and creatures God wanted demanded the opportunity for evil. We could say the kind of world, the kind of creation that God was after demanded the opportunity for evil. It had to be in the whole picture. And so let's just kind of go back to the beginning and think about this. In the beginning, where does suffering come from? The nature of the world in which we live and our nature as human beings demands the potential of evil and suffering, in my view. So we make the trek back to Genesis chapter 1, and we find God's statement about the sort of things he was about to create when he got started with humans. It says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish in the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God says, we're going to create a thing, and this is what it's going to look like. We're going to make man in our own image. Now, the question that we want to ask is, what does it mean to create God in our own image? Well, we know that he's not talking about that we would look like him, right? Because what we understand about God is that God doesn't have a shape, right? God is spirit. That's a part of his nature. It's a part of his nature that makes him omnipresent, right? He can be everywhere present at the same time because he doesn't have a shape like you and I have. Like I'm bound within this shape, and this shape limits where I can go. I can only be at one place at one time. God's different. So we know God, when he says, let's make man in our own image, he's not talking about the shape. We understand that what God's after in creating us in his image is that he's making persons like himself, in the sense that we have choice and we have the opportunity to be in a love relationship, that we're going to have will, volition. That's the nature of what he's creating when he creates us. I think John chapter 1 is a really great creation story also, right? You have Genesis 1, but you also have John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And everything that was created through him. And then when you get down to chapter 1, verse 11, it says that he came to his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. You see, what I think is really important about John chapter 1 is that God tells us what he was after from the very beginning, sons and daughters. He says, Christ came to his own, but not everyone received him. But everyone who did receive him, they got to become sons and daughters of God. See, God, as a necessarily perfect being, doesn't need us. He wouldn't be perfect, he wouldn't be complete if he needed us. He has no need. God creates us because he wants us, like he wants children. That's what John 1 says, that he came and whoever received him became sons and daughters. God was creating sons and daughters. He wasn't looking for pets, he was looking for children. And that's sometimes a painful project. Children not born of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but children born of God. And so when God created humans, he created them with free will, the ability to choose or to not choose him. I want to take you to the next chapter of Genesis chapter 2, beginning in verse 15. And so we have this interesting part of the story. says, then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you do eat of it, you shall surely die. Have you ever wondered about what's the point of the tree? Why is the tree here? I can only make sense of it this way. The tree is here as a point of decision. It's a point of choice. When I was really a lot younger, 30 years ago when I came to Moses Lake, and there was a couple that would come to church quite a lot. She was a believer, but he wasn't a believer. But he got to be a really good friend of mine. We hung out a lot, and we played racquetball 3 days a week, and he was on this journey to figure out, what he believed, and he just couldn't get there in his faith. And one day we were driving down to the athletic club to play racquetball, and he said to me, here's a question. He said, why is it that, God gives us so many rules, there's so many things we can't do, and so few things it seems like we can do? Why does God make the list of things that we can't do so much bigger than the list of the things we can do? It's really annoying. I mean, if he wouldn't have made such a long list of things we can't do, it would have been easier to follow him. Why did he do that? And to be frank, I was stumped by the question. I was like, this is often the case with me, like if I don't know it, I try not to fake it because I always get caught with that, right? It was like, I don't know. That's a really good question. It would be better, wouldn't it, if there weren't so many things we couldn't do, and just, it would be better. I agree. But I said, I don't know the answer to the question. I'll have to stew on that for a while. And so I did. I kind of stumbled around on that question for a few weeks, and then it occurred to me. I came back to him. I said, I think I know the answer to the question. In the beginning, almost everything was okay. In the beginning, there was actually only one thing God said don't do, and that was don't eat from this tree. Everything else was permissible. Everything else was acceptable. There was only one thing God said don't do, and that's the beginning. Don't eat from this tree, and when you do, you'll surely die. There was only one thing God said, don't do this. So what's the point of this tree? The only sense that I can make of it is that God wants to have children who want to be in relationship with him. And so he says, this is what I'm asking you to do. If you want to be in relationship with me, this is what you have to do. And then I'll know. Because he was after a love relationship. He wasn't after just people who would just go through the motions of what he was asking them to do. And so the point of the tree is a decision point. It's the opportunity for obedience or disobedience. It's the opportunity of fellowship or separation. It's the opportunity of friendship or enmity. That's what's going to be decided with the tree. And the problem with the tree was that God gave them the free will to choose or not to choose the tree. And sometimes when you give your kids a choice, they choose the thing you wish they wouldn't choose. I spent the last 4 days with two of my best friends from high school. These guys, we do this trip every summer. 4 days we hang out together, and we just talk about stuff. We argue most of the time. It's exhausting. By the time the end comes, it's just like, I just want to go home and get some rest, because we don't always look at the world the same way. And we don't always look at the world the same way. What I mean by that is we actually never look at the world the same way. And so it's really an interesting time, but I love hanging out with them. And my friend John is just getting ready to get married, and he's going to be marrying a young lady who has 2 children. And my friend John is my age. And so I was asking him yesterday on the drive home. He drove me back from Chalice, Idaho, which is somewhere on the order of 1,000 miles from here. And in a car, it's a long ways. And we were driving back, and I said to John, I said, man, you're going to be a stepdad, so you're going to have kids soon. You've never had kids before. What are you thinking about that? He's like, I have no idea. I said, you don't even know how you don't have any idea. Like, you don't even have a clue how awful it's going to be. Just terrible. It's one of the most challenging things you're ever going to do in your life. It's just going to be their days. It's just going to be painful. And it's also going to be like the most wonderful thing ever. Really, it's that challenge, isn't it? If you have children, you know that. There are like times when it's just like the greatest thing ever, and then there are times when you're like, I don't have a clue what to do next, because the little critters came with this really annoying thing called will. And sometimes you say, I'm going to need you to go this way, and they're going to okay, not this time. Right? It's really challenging, but this is what God was up to. He was creating children. He wanted sons and daughters, and so they came with the potential of evil, the potential of choosing the wrong thing. C.S. Lewis says this: God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go either wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which has free will but has no possibility of going wrong. I cannot. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. A world of automata, of creatures that worked like machines, would hardly be worth creating. Of course, God knew what would happen if they used their freedom in the wrong way. Apparently, he thought it was worth the risk. And so when we think about evil and suffering in the world, in large part, on my view, that's the nature of the world. It came with the potential for choices that would be not helpful, and actually that could bring corruption and brokenness into the world. And the effect of Adam's choice and Eve's choice in the garden isn't just a matter of sin, death, and decay that affects us as human persons, but it actually affects all of creation. So when you think about what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, he says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pain of childbirth together until now." Paul says, look, human persons aren't the only people suffering in this corrupt world. All of creation is groaning and suffering because of the corruption that came into the world through sin. And as it's come in, it just rolls outward. And so it breaks everything that it touches. And so when we look at the disease that we see today, whether it's cancer or AIDS or malaria or anything you want to name, it's a consequence of the corruption of nature, not necessarily the choice that someone made, but the corruption of nature itself is breaking down. And we say, well, yeah, but why does this kind of stuff, happen to an innocent child, where some horrible disease happens to an innocent child? What's God doing? Well, it's just the nature of the corruption of the creation itself, and it falls on people. It's no respecter of persons. It's no respecter of ages. Like some people have asked the question, why do the righteous suffer? Because they live in a corrupt world where brokenness attaches itself to them at different times. It's just the nature of it. And it impacts us all. And we say, yeah, but what about the really evil people in the world, right? We could all say, this is an easy one. Why Hitler? Why did God let Hitler live? Surely we could have at least just gotten rid of Hitler. He was such a bad guy. Right, and God could, certainly God has the power to do it, but he doesn't do it. But when you get to that, you got to ask the question, well, who would be the next most evil person? So God says, yeah, Hitler's just too bad. Get rid of him. Who's the next one? Who's the next most evil person? Was it Stalin? Is it Saddam Hussein? Who is it? The problem is you get down to, it's me. This is the problem. If God removes the evil people, pretty soon we're out. Because you're probably not the most evil person in the world, but there's some in you and you're not free of it. So why has God let you hang around as an evil person? Because the sort of creation that he was making required free will. The sort of creation that God had in mind brought with it inherently free will. Lewis goes on to say this: the moment that you have a self at all, there is a possibility of putting yourself first. At whatever point you have a self, there is the possibility of putting the self first. Wanting to be the center. Wanting to be God, in fact. Okay, back to the garden, right? God says, don't eat from this tree, and as soon as you do, you'll surely die. And the serpent says, oh, come on, you're not going to die. In fact, here's the real thing God doesn't want you to know. When you eat of the tree, you'll be like him, and he doesn't want you to be like him. And they're like, we want to be like him. We want to be the center. We want to be in charge. And so at whatever point there is a the self can want to be in the center. And at whatever point the self wants to get in the center, there's a really good chance that evil or suffering or brokenness of some sort is going to be the next step in that parade. James talks about this in James chapter 4. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and you do not have, so you murder? You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel? You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. This is what James is saying. The problem with evil and suffering is it comes into the world because I want what I want and I want it now and I don't care what I have to do to get it. And I'm willing to push people out of the way and I'm willing to knock things over in order to get the sort of thing that I want. And sometimes the choices that other people make impact you in a really negative way. We were hanging around this week with my friends Bruce and John, and we were over in Stanley, Idaho. We drove from Stanley, Idaho back to Chalice. And the road, we were driving this Dodge 1500 crew cab. Let me just tell you about the road from Stanley to Chalice. It's about as wide as this table. There's no room. There is no room to make an error. And I'm not making this up when I tell you that it's the road and then it's the river. In fact, in most of the places, there's not even enough of a shoulder to put a guardrail. I find myself driving, thinking, could you just not have found a way to put a guardrail on this thing, right? And so we're going, and I know I'm trying to really paying attention. In fact, my friends, I was driving most of the week, and when we drove into Chalice the last day, they got there, they go, that road was way more fun to ride than to drive. It's really not pleasant. I'm like, I get it. And we were going along, and I was, paying attention. I was really paying attention because there's just no room for error on this road. And I come around a corner, and I'm thinking, there's a guy coming in this old pickup that probably doesn't steer as well as it used to. It's like one of those that you got to go like this to get a little turn. And he's over in my lane, and I'm thinking, how far can I go? It's like, dude, get off your phone. What are you doing? Pay attention. Some way he wasn't paying attention. He swerved back over, trailers going like this, and we're just eking out there as much as we can. I was thinking about real potential for suffering for me because of his choice there, right? Real potential for suffering for all three of us in that car and for him too, because he wasn't paying attention. He was making a choice to do whatever he was doing that wasn't focused. It's not God judging me, like God mad at me, so he gets me in a head-on collision. Or I actually thought about it, dude, I'm going to the river. I'm going to take my shot in the river. I don't want a head-on collision. I'm just going to see if I can get far enough out there to hit something soft. But his choice really could have created suffering in my life and my family's life and my friends' families and all of us. But that's what comes with a world where there's choice and where there's free will. Because evil and suffering are in the world, because the sort of world and creatures God wanted demanded the opportunity for evil. And in spite of our emotional opposition to what I'm about to say, there are things God cannot do. Let that soak for just a second. There are things that God cannot do, right? Like, for instance, it's impossible for God to lie. We know that God can't lie. God can't die. We know that's the case. God can't die. That's part of his nature is eternal. And he can't be evil because his nature is good. And it's possible that not even he can create a world in which mankind has free will to choose him, while at the same time there's no opportunity for evil or for suffering. One of the foremost Christian philosophers of our day, Alvin Plantinga, says this in his book, Free Will and Evil. You should grab it and read it. It's not really big, thick books like you'd think philosophers should write, but it's small and you can get a hold of it. He says this: omnipotence means maximum power and does not allow for things that cannot be done. That is the logically impossible. Thus, evil may be the result of God's choice to permit radical freedom. That resonates a little bit, doesn't it? So you think about the way the world works and the radical freedom that people have, which has the great potential of bringing evil and suffering into the world. And the real problem of evil And suffering, practically speaking, is that it's evil and it's suffering. And we don't like it. We don't like pain. We don't like it when it hits us. And so the mystery of it is prevalent for us to watch and to walk through. We know it when we see it, and it's painful, and we don't want to do it, and yet it faces us. And so while we may know why evil exists, and however you decide to embrace that there is evil and suffering in the world, whether you decide that God's just stopped paying attention, or whether you decide that God actually brings it into our lives, or whether you decide it's a part of the free will that's inherent in our creation, whatever you decide about evil, you still have to deal with it because it's still here and you still have to walk through it. And so really it does come down to, in some ways, the response to evil and suffering is trusting the goodness of God. We have to trust the goodness of God in the midst of it. And that's not always the easiest thing either. You remember Job. Job faces some really tough stuff. That's a quirky story in any way you slice it. But God allows this stuff to come into Job's life, and he loses everything that he has. And to the point that his wife is like, dude, like, God, why are you still following? Why are you still, just quit. You should curse God and die. Like, that's what you should do. And Job is really confused. And Job goes through the story saying, why are you doing this to me? God, what's up with this? Why are you causing this? What he wants to say is this, I think. I don't deserve this. I'm a really good guy. Like, I'm a really good person. I've done good stuff. I take care of people who need things. I've used my wealth to make the world a better place. I don't deserve this. Why are you causing me to go through this? And there's a point at which God said, you just don't see enough. You can't see far enough. You can't see the whole picture. You don't know what you don't know. And God just kind of, it's kind of towards the end, he says to Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? You don't know what's going on. It's so much bigger than anything you can see or understand. Who enclosed the sea with doors when bursting forth it went out from the womb? Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place? Where is the way to the dwelling light and darkness? Where is its place? Do you know the time the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? I mean, it's a rhetorical question, right? God's saying, you just don't see far enough, Job. You just don't see it. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching his wings toward the south? Job, you don't know enough. And finally, Job says, behold, I'm insignificant. What can I reply to you? I know that you can do all things, that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. But now my eyes see you. Therefore I retract and I repent in dust and ashes. Okay. All right, uncle. I can't see everything that's going on, and I don't know everything that's going on. And so in the midst of this, we do have to actually back up and say, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of pain, what do we do? And what can we know about God in the midst of this? And we accept the truth of this, that God is working things out for good. Even though he may not cause them in your life, he can bring them around to good. And that's what Romans 8 says to us, right? He's working out all things for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. The only change here is that the perspective. It's now we're looking to him to say, what are you trying to do in the midst of this? How can you bring about good? And if we're not asking that question, the likelihood is we're not going to see it. We're not going to see it. And then Paul says this, you think about Paul's life and the suffering and the pain and the evil that he witnessed and he went through. He says, but hey, I consider that the sufferings of this moment are not worthy to be compared to the glory that's going to be revealed to us. Okay, so first of all, perspective. God, what do you want to do in me and through me and to me in the midst of this suffering? Whatever you decide, you still have to go there. Whether you decide that suffering is a matter of free will or you decide that suffering is a matter of the sovereignty of God brought into your life by God, you still have to ask that question. God, what are you trying to get at with me? That's perspective change. And then you have to say, I know that this is just momentary. Because our lives are just momentary. We're not going to be here very long. And Paul says, this is just a thin place here that I'm walking through. It may seem really big, and I'm not making light of any suffering that you're going through. I'm not trying to do that, but the reality is it's light and momentary compared to all of eternity. That's what Paul says. And James tells us this thing that we really struggle with. I mean, maybe you're good at this, I'm not. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Is that what you do when trial comes into your life? Lord, thank you. I thought this was going to be a boring week, but it turns out it's going to be fun because there's trials. Right? I'm so grateful for this. But that's what James says. You got to consider it joy when you have trials of various kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So James is saying, wherever the trials and suffering comes from, the point is that it's going to perfect you if you will allow that to be the case. Now, if you allow it not to be the case, then it's probably the suffering and difficulty you go through just going to make you bitter and grumpy and mad and dislike the world and say God doesn't exist. But if we will allow it, the suffering can have a purpose of perfecting us. Irenaeus, one of the church fathers, wrote around 180 AD that not even God can create a man out of nothing who is mature. Irenaeus is saying, not even God could create a mature man. It takes suffering. Not even God can create a mature woman. It takes suffering. It takes challenges. It takes trials. And it takes walking through it. That's what can happen as we walk through suffering. No matter what causes it, no matter where it comes from, it can perfect us if we will allow it. And there's no other way to be perfected than to go through difficulty. And so the conclusion is there's no easy answer, because suffering and evil are just hard. And if we could pencil it all out, it's still suffering, and it's still difficulty, and it's still a challenge. A challenge that continues to come into our lives no matter what we think about it. But if we can have our perspective be that God is able to make really hard things into good things, if we can understand that these moments that we face suffering are short, that this life is short, and if we can embrace the reality that the difficult stuff we go through actually makes us better, then we can endure it. And some people do that and some people don't. There's a guy by the name of Elie Wiesel who wrote a book called Night, and it was about his experience in the concentration camp. And he spent time in Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and he wrote these words in his book, Night. If you haven't seen it, you should get hold of it. It's a little book, and it's really good. But he says this in that book. He says, "Never shall I forget that night, that first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never." So Elie Wiesel lives through the concentration camp, but it killed his faith, and it killed his belief in the existence of God. There's another person you probably know of, Corrie ten Boom, who also lived through the concentration camps, and she went there and she lost a lot of people that she cared about, and her sister died in the concentration camp. In fact, Corrie ten Boom was released 15 days after her sister Betsy died. She was released because of a clerical error, and 7 days after she was released, all the women her age in that camp were sent to the chambers, the gas chambers. And Corrie tells of having this conversation with her sister Betsy, and she's saying, how can God exist? How can God allow this? How can this darkness really come to this place? And her sister says this to her: there's no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. It's just perspective. And I don't say just perspective in that it's simple. Elie Wiesel lost his faith, and I have no words of judgment whatsoever. But perspective is the only difference between how they came out. And so it reminds us of the words of Spurgeon, who says, God is too wise to be mistaken. God is too good to be unkind. And so when you can't trace his hand, that's when you have to learn to trust his heart. There are certain things we have to say, God, I don't see where you're going. I don't see what you're doing. But I'm going to trust you in the midst of this because I don't know what else to do. And whatever you decide is the case for why suffering exists, you still have to endure it because it's in our world. It might be in your life right now. And I don't want to belittle that in any way. But how do we reflect on that? How do we walk through that? And so are you in the midst of suffering or evil today? And if so, how are you walking through that? How are you finding your way through it? Do you have people to walk with you through suffering? Or are you walking with someone else through their suffering? We're called to walk together. One author has said this, in the end, we're all just walking each other home. So if you're going through suffering and challenging times, do you have people to walk with? You need people. And you need people who will be honest with you. You need people who won't just be on your side. You need people who ask you hard questions. Ask, what's God trying to get at with you? What can he get at with you in the midst of this? What is your view of why suffering exists? You might need to wrestle through some of that. Maybe pick up some things and read it. What's one practice that you've placed in your life that routinely reminds you of the goodness of God? This is a really important question. Because perspective is seeing God. And we're not going to see God if we're not worshiping. And it's occurred to me lately in the last year or two of my life that some things you can't work yourself out of, you just have to worship yourself out of. It's about getting your perspective clearly on God and seeing him. And if you don't have a practice of worship, it's going to be difficult to do that. And do you feel isolated and alone in your suffering? If you do, you're not meant to. You're not meant to walk through suffering alone. And so how could you, or to whom could you reach out in the next week and ask for help and support? Who's out there that might be able to help you? So whatever we think about why suffering exists, we do know it exists. And sometimes we have to go through it. And it's painful. And we shouldn't go through it alone. But God can use it to make beautiful things in our lives, to perfect us and to mature us, so that we can have the best life available and for his glory.